Solid Tales, History Uncovered. Welcome back to Solid Tales. History uncovered. For 150 years, the United States and Russia, first the Russian Empire, then the Soviet Union, have never known true peace. They've been bitter rivals, nuclear adversaries, and twice, only twice, reluctant brothers in blood. Both of those fleeting alliances were forged not from friendship, but from the cold steel of shared survival. Both ended the second the common enemy turned to ash. This is the brutal, untold anatomy of the world's most dangerous geopolitical tightrope. For most of the 19th century, these two continental titans barely crossed paths. Separated by thousands of miles of ocean, their imperial ambitions rarely collided. Their ideological divides lay dormant. But as the 20th century dawned, the world shrank. The global scramble for power intensified, and the two giants could no longer ignore one another. By 1907, Washington and St. Petersburg struck a rare, fragile strategic alignment in the Far East. The Tsar needed to choke off Imperial Japan's aggressive expansion. Washington demanded a balance of power in the Pacific. It was a brief handshake in the dark. American ports opened wide to Russian grain, timber, and industrial raw materials, and trade boomed. But beneath the surface, a fatal wedge was already driving them apart. The American public and Congress recoiled from the Tsar's autocracy. The lingering chains of serfdom, the violent crushing of dissent, the mass executions and exiles to Siberian gulags. Human rights wasn't just a talking point, it was an uncrossable line. Then the world split open. In March 1917, the February Revolution ripped the Tsar from his throne at gunpoint and installed a bourgeois provisional government. Washington didn't hesitate. They recognized the new regime instantly, flooding it with aid, weapons, and capital. Their motive was brutally pragmatic. They needed millions of Russian soldiers to stay in the trenches, to keep firing at Imperial Germany, to keep the German war machine pinned down on the Eastern Front. When the U.S. plunged into the bloodbath of World War I in April 1917, they fought alongside Russia as allied partners. Washington shipped mountains of military hardware and massive loans to the Eastern Front, desperate to bleed Germany white and ease the slaughter on the Western Front. For a moment, wartime necessity buried Washington's disgust for Russian authoritarianism. But in October 1917, the ground collapsed entirely. The Bolsheviks seized power in a lightning coup, and American pragmatism curdled into rabid hostility. Vladimir Lenin's regime didn't just seek control of Russia, it openly called for the total annihilation of the global capitalist order, striking at the very bedrock of American power. Worse, the newborn Soviet state flatly refused to repay the massive debts owed by the Tsar and the provisional government, and seized every last dollar of American corporate and private assets on Soviet soil. The bridges were burned. Washington retaliated. It refused to recognize the Soviet state and joined the Allied armed intervention. Between 1918 and 1920, American combat boots crunched into the frozen mud of Siberia and onto the ice-scoured docks of Arkhangelsk, where -40-degree winds sliced through wool uniforms, froze rifle bolts solid, and turned exposed skin to black frostbite in 10 minutes flat. This was no diplomatic gesture. It was a direct military attempt to strangle the socialist regime in its cradle. For the entire 1920s, Washington enforced a total diplomatic blackout. It locked the Soviet Union in complete isolation, acting as if the sprawling communist empire simply did not exist. When Franklin D. Roosevelt took the oath of office in 1933, the two nations had spent 16 years locked in a bitter, unrecognized standoff. But FDR was a cold, calculating realist. He looked out at a world teetering on the edge of the abyss. The Great Depression had gutted American industry and hollowed out the working class. Across the globe, the militarized shadows of fascist Germany, Italy, and Japan stretched further with every passing month. To Roosevelt, Soviet relations were never a moral crusade. They were a tool of American national survival. In 1933, during high-stakes closed-door negotiations in Washington, Roosevelt shocked the world. He ended 16 years of hostility overnight and granted the Soviet Union full diplomatic recognition. This was no emotional reconciliation. It was a transactional high-stakes gamble. The U.S. stamped its approval on Moscow's legitimacy. In exchange, the Soviets swore to halt all communist subversion inside American borders, guaranteed religious freedom for U.S. citizens trapped on Soviet soil, and agreed to reopen negotiations over the toxic, unresolved debt dispute. Roosevelt's eyes were fixed on two non-negotiable prizes, prying open the massive, untapped Soviet market to breathe life back into dying American factories and forging a geopolitical anvil in East Asia to blunt Imperial Japan's relentless expansion. But make no mistake, Roosevelt never let his guard down. He maintained a deep, paranoid vigilance over the Soviet socialist machine, even as he shook their hand. The entire geopolitical chessboard flipped on June 22, 1941, when Adolf Hitler unleashed Operation Barbarossa and 3 million Wehrmacht troops stormed across the Soviet border. In an instant, Washington and Moscow morphed from wary strangers into deeply intertwined brothers in blood. The Soviet Union, overnight, became the only meat grinder on Earth capable of chewing up the Nazi war machine. For the Red Army, the invasion was a catastrophe beyond imagination. In the first 3 weeks alone, 3 million Soviet soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. Divisions evaporated overnight. Troops retreated hundreds of miles with no ammunition, no food, no hope. Moscow itself was within the Wehrmacht's grasp. This was the moment the Soviet Union could have collapsed entirely. FDR rammed the Lend-Lease Act through Congress, igniting one of the greatest logistical miracles in human history. The United States pumped a staggering $11 billion worth of supplies into the bleeding Soviet heartland, a sum equal to over $220 billion in 2024 currency. This wasn't just a line item on a budget. It was 14,000 combat aircraft, 44,000 jeeps, 375,000 heavy trucks, 8,000 anti-aircraft guns, and 2.3 million tons of grain, enough to feed every Red Army soldier on the front line for 4 full years. This river of American steel, aviation fuel, and calories became the vital external lifeline that kept the Red Army from collapsing under the Nazi onslaught. At the Tehran and Yalta summits, amid cigar smoke and wall-sized battle maps, FDR and Joseph Stalin engineered a synchronized, apocalyptic two-front war. They locked in the timing of the D-Day landings in Normandy with the Red Army's massive, earth-shattering counteroffensives in the east, forging a steel vice that would ultimately crush Berlin. To secure Stalin's promise to turn the full might of the Red Army on Japan after Germany's surrender, Roosevelt swallowed his pride and made heavy compromises on territorial interests in the Far East. Roosevelt prioritized the total annihilation of fascism over the ideological chasm between the two nations, but he was already planting seeds for the post-war world. He recognized the Soviet Union's crippling paranoia about security in Eastern Europe, even as he engineered the creation of the United Nations to leash Moscow's global ambitions. He worked tirelessly to resuscitate the battered militaries of Britain and France, to build a post-war counterweight to Soviet power. It was a masterful, delicate balance, designed to prevent the next global war. That delicate balance shattered on April 12, 1945. FDR died suddenly at Warm Springs, and with him, the era of great power compromise was buried forever. Harry S. Truman inherited the Oval Office, and with it, the most powerful, untouched economic and military apparatus in human history, including a top-secret weapon of unimaginable destructive power just months from completion. Truman looked out at the smoldering ruins of post-war Europe and immediately discarded Roosevelt's diplomatic tact. The flashpoint was Poland. Truman brought a sledgehammer to negotiations, unleashing a barrage of blistering, unapologetic rhetoric against Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov, shattering the careful diplomatic channels that had won the war. The thin facade of post-war unity vaporized almost overnight. By 1946, Winston Churchill stood at a podium in Fulton, Missouri, and declared that an iron curtain had descended across the European continent. From Moscow, American diplomat George Kennan fired off the legendary long telegram, a chilling, methodical blueprint for the total containment of Soviet power. By 1947, the Truman Doctrine was born. The wartime alliance was officially, permanently dead. The Cold War had begun. The U.S. flooded global airwaves with the narrative of the Soviet threat, forged the mighty NATO military alliance, and launched a global crusade to choke out Soviet influence on every corner of the planet. It was an ideology-fueled deathmatch that would dictate the survival of the human race for nearly half a century, a hostility so deep it outlived the collapse of the Soviet Union and shapes the relationship between Washington and Moscow to this very day. This 20th century saga lays bare the ultimate, unforgiving law of global history. Ideologies will always clash, but they will bow to the threat of a common enemy, and the moment that enemy turns to ash, the old hatreds will rise from the smoke. There are no eternal allies, no eternal enemies, only eternal interests. If you want to uncover more hidden, brutal histories of the Second World War and the Cold War, hit the like button, subscribe to SolidTales, and ring the notification bell so you never miss an episode. Drop a comment below. Do you think the Allied victory in World War II would have been possible without the U.S. Soviet alliance? Let's debate it in the comments. History Uncovered. Subscribe to SolidTales.